Late at night, Andre walks alone while talking on the phone. After he hangs up, he notices a car following him, so he starts walking in the opposite direction as fast as possible. Suddenly a guy wearing a helmet jumps on him from behind and knocks him out. Andre is then put in the trunk of the car. Sometime later, photographer Chris and his girlfriend Rose are packing for a trip. Chris will meet Rose's parents for the first time, and he's nervous because she never dated a black man before. Rose assures him that there's nothing to worry about because her parents aren't racist. The couple leaves in Rose's car and Chris tries to smoke a cigarette, but Rose throws it out the window. Then Chris calls his best friend Rod, who works for the Transportation Security Administration or TSA. Chris thanks Rod for taking care of his dog, and they joke about the fact that Rose ended up with Chris when she should be with Rod. The couple is so distracted that they accidentally hit an animal in the road. They immediately get out of the car and confirm they've killed a deer. The mere sight of the body leaves Chris very upset. Soon a cop arrives and Rose tells him they're going to her parents' house in the lake area. The officer still asks Chris for an ID, so Rose calls him out for racially profiling until he leaves. Moments later they finally arrive at the house, where they're welcomed by groundskeeper Walter. Then Chris finally meets Rose's parents Dean and Missy. While they chat, Walter watches them from afar. The couple shares what happened with the deer and Dean is actually happy about it, saying that he hates deer because they're taking over. He asks them how long they've been dating and Rose answers 5 months while Chris says 4. Afterward Dean takes Chris on a tour of the house. Missy has her own office because she's a psychiatrist and she sees her patients here. When they look at some pictures on the wall, Dean points at Rose's brother Jeremy, who is studying to be a surgeon like Dean. He also shows Chris a picture of his father, a runner who lost to a black man in front of Hitler in the 1936 Berlin Olympics and never got over it. The duo passes by the basement door and Dean explains they had to seal it off because of a black mold problem. In the kitchen, Dean introduces Chris to their black maid Georgina. Then they go to the backyard, and Dean explains that the nearest house is across the lake so they have total privacy. Walter is nearby, so Dean admits he knows how badly cliché it looks for a rich white family to have black servants. He shares that he hired Walter and Georgina to take care of his parents, and after they died he didn't have the heart to fire them. Dean claims he hates how this makes the family look and swears he voted for Obama every time. During lunch, Dean asks Chris about his parents. Chris shares that his father wasn't around and his mother died in a hit-and-run accident when he was 11. Dean notices that Chris is tapping his knuckle on the table and asks if he smokes, so Chris tells him that he's quitting. Dean suggests that Missy could hypnotize him to get him to quit, saying that he smoked for 15 years and the hypnosis helped him. However, Chris turns the offer down. The parents then remind Rose that it's the weekend of a party they throw every year, which is a tradition started by Dean's father. Rose freaks out and wonders why they didn't tell her sooner, but her parents point out that it's on the same date every year. When Georgina comes closer to refill their glasses, she suddenly freezes and spills the drink. The splash snaps her out of it and Missy tells her to go rest. At that moment, Jeremy arrives. Over dinner, Jeremy tells Chris lots of embarrassing stories about Rose's childhood. When they discuss sports, Chris shares that he used to do judo after school. Getting very intense, Jeremy says that if Chris trained he could be a beast. He talks a lot about jiu-jitsu before rushing to Chris's side, trying to convince him to fight him. Chris says he won't fight anyone drunk and Jeremy's parents scold him, so he leaves the room. Later in the bedroom, Rose complains about her family's behavior, saying they aren't different than the cop. Chris says I told you so, so Rose apologizes, but he assures her that it's fine. They share a long kiss and Rose warns Chris that the party will be very white. In the middle of the night, Chris can't sleep. When he notices Rose's childhood plushie on the nightstand, he feels uncomfortable and turns it around. Then he sneaks downstairs to smoke in secret, unaware that Georgina is nearby. In the front yard, Chris gets his cigarette ready but he freezes as he sees Walter running toward him. When Walter is about to crash into him, he makes a turn to dodge him at the last second. Then Chris turns around and finds Georgina looking at her reflection on the door. He waits until she's gone to go back inside. Chris tries to reach the stairs but he freezes again when he hears Missy telling him that smoking is dangerous. He realizes she's only teasing and agrees to sit with her. Then Missy tells him about her hypnosis techniques, which use a focal point to guide the person into a state of heightened suggestibility. She keeps stirring her tea as she talks, asking Chris where he was when his mother died. At first he refuses to talk about it, but Missy starts stirring faster and Chris shares that he'd been watching television on the day his mother died. Soon Chris starts crying and scratching the chair, realizing he can't move. Missy comments on the fact that he feels guilty about his mother's death and suddenly tells him to sink into the floor. Chris tries to resist, but he sinks into the chair and the same thing happens to his younger self in the memory. The hypnosis has put Chris in a state of mind that makes him feel like he's floating in space. Missy calls it the sunken place and closes his eyes, but at that moment Chris wakes up in bed. He checks his phone when it rings, however it's only a picture of his dog sent by Rod. It seems the charger was disconnected last night so he connects it again. Later Chris goes for a walk in the forest to take some pictures. On his way back, he sees Georgina through the window taking care of her hair. He tries to take a picture of her but she turns around, so he pretends to be looking at something else. When he looks again, she's gone. Then he approaches Walter, who is chopping wood and says that this is what he wants to do. Walter thinks Chris is lucky to have Rose, although his laughter is weird. He also apologizes to Chris for scaring him last night and reveals he saw him with Missy, so he asks if the hypnosis worked. Creeped out, Chris claims he doesn't remember because he drank too much. Afterward, Chris searches for Rose and tells her that he thinks Missy hypnotized him. He doesn't remember what happened, but he's now disgusted by the idea of smoking. When it's finally time for the party, Rose introduces Chris to the guests, and all of them have rude comments to make about his race. An elderly couple mentions that they love Tiger Woods, a woman touches his muscles while asking if it's true that black men have better eggplants, and a man says that black is in fashion instead of fairer skin. Chris removes himself from the uncomfortable conversations by getting busy taking pictures. At the table, he's surprised to see another black man, so he goes to introduce himself. Logan has a very vacant expression and only answers with basic words. They're interrupted by Logan's wife, who reminds him they have to keep mingling. Chris says goodbye by putting out his fist for a bump, but Logan awkwardly shakes it instead and goes to talk to some guests. These people watch him turn as if he was showing off his existence. Then Chris admires the gazebo and meets a blind man called Jim, who thinks these guests have no idea what real people go through. Jim also says that he likes Chris's work, making him realize that he's a gallery owner. It turns out an assistant describes the art to Jim, and he thinks Chris's photos are brutal and melancholic. Jim also used to be a photographer and even submitted his work to National Geographic, but he lost his vision shortly after. When Chris enters the house, everyone falls silent as he takes the stairs and they listen to all his footsteps. In the bedroom, Chris discovers that the charger was disconnected again and the phone's now dead. After reconnecting it, he tells Rose that he thinks Georgina unplugged his phone because she doesn't approve of their relationship. Rose thinks the idea is ridiculous and goes back to the party. Chris then calls Rod to tell him about the hypnotism and people's attitude here, saying they never met a black person that wasn't their servant. He also shares that the few black people living here are deranged. Rod is worried because he thinks the family may use the hypnotism to slave Chris, who mocks the idea. After Chris hangs up, he's startled by Georgina at the door. She apologizes for touching his belongings, saying she was just cleaning. Chris promises he didn't mean to snitch and explains he just gets nervous when he's around too many white people. This comment makes Georgina clearly uncomfortable, but she quickly covers it with tears and awkward laughter, saying that her bosses treat her and Walter as family. When Chris returns to the party, Dean introduces him to even more fancy people. A Japanese man asks him if African Americans have more advantages or disadvantages in the modern world, so Chris laughs and says he doesn't know. He makes Logan answer instead, and Logan explains very awkwardly that being black has been a good experience, although he admits he doesn't leave the house much. While Logan talks, Chris takes a picture of him and forgets to turn off the flash. The light makes Logan freeze and his nose bleed. Suddenly Logan grabs Chris by his clothes and keeps telling him to get out, now talking in a more informal tone. Jeremy drags Logan away as he keeps yelling in agony. Minutes later, Dean tells everyone that Logan had a seizure, which can create anxiety and aggression. He claims that the camera flash triggered it. At that moment Logan returns and apologizes to everyone, talking very awkwardly again. He explains he's exhausted now, so he and his wife leave. Afterwards Rose and Chris go on a walk. Chris tells Rose that Logan didn't have a seizure and reveals he has an epileptic cousin, so he knows what a seizure is supposed to look like. However, Rose still trusts her father since he's a neurosurgeon. Chris also admits that when Logan went crazy, he felt like he knew him. He thinks Missy has put weird thoughts in his head and wants to leave, which upsets Rose. Meanwhile, Dean and the guests seem to be playing silent bingo at the gazebo. However, they're actually auctioning off Chris, and Jim is the one who wins. As the sun sets, Chris and Rose are still in the forest. Chris explains he feels guilty about his mother's death because he didn't call 911 or go looking for her when she didn't come home from work. The car that hit her didn't actually kill her, she died the next morning on the side of the road. Chris cries as he points out that she could have survived if someone had looked for her. He tells Rose that she's all he has and asks her to go home together, so she agrees. When they return to the house, the last guests are leaving. Chris notices the whole family staring at him creepily before he enters the house. In the bathroom, Chris secretly sends Logan's picture to Rod, who immediately calls him. Rod has recognized Logan as Andre, the ex-boyfriend of a friend of theirs. Chris finally remembers him too and wonders why he changed so much, so Rod repeats his theory of the family using hypnotism to make slaves. At that moment the call mysteriously ends. Then Chris tells Rose they have to leave as soon as possible. While Rose goes looking for her bag, Chris notices the closet door is open. He looks inside and finds a box full of old photographs showing Rose with a variety of ex-girlfriends and boyfriends, including Georgina and Walter. All these exes are black. A creeped out Chris closes the door and finds Rose waiting, although she can't find her keys in her bag. They go downstairs, only to find Jeremy blocking the front door with a lacrosse stick. Missy wonders what's happening and Chris says they're leaving, so Rose makes up a story about his dog being sick. While Rose keeps looking for her keys, Dean asks Chris what his purpose in life is. Chris is too confused to answer, so Dean talks about people being gods trapped in human form. Growing scared, Chris yells at Rose to ask for the keys, so Jeremy swings his stick at him and Chris has to dodge him. Rose appears to be crying, but suddenly her face gets serious as she reveals she had the keys all along yet refuses to give them to him. Chris tries to run to the door, however Jeremy blocks him and Missy taps her teacup, causing Chris to collapse as he faints. Chris's mind is stuck in the sunken place but he can still see Jeremy and Dean moving him while Rose tells him that he was one of her favorites. The next morning Chris wakes up tied to a chair in the basement, which is a game room and not moldy at all. He tries to get out but he can't undo the bindings. Suddenly a TV plays a video of Rose's grandfather, who says that Chris has been chosen because of the physical advantages he's enjoyed his entire life. It turns out the family has developed a process called coagula, which allows them to transfer a white person's brain into a black person's body. This way they fuse white intellect with black strength. All this time, Rose has been dating black people to gather new victims. Then the video shows Missy stirring the tea and Chris passes out again. Meanwhile Rod tries to call Chris to no avail. After feeding Chris's dog, Rod looks up Andre on the internet and discovers he went missing 6 months ago. He decides to go to the police, showing them the picture of Andre that Chris took and sharing his hypnotized slave theory. However the detectives only laugh at him. Afterward Rod calls Rose, who tells him that Chris left 2 days ago. When Rod says he hasn't heard from him, Rose pretends to be very upset. Rod suspects she's lying and starts recording her before asking about hypnotism. Rose accuses Rod of calling her because he's interested in her, causing him to freak out and hang up. In the basement, Chris wakes up and the TV plays another video. This time Jim appears to explain the procedure. Step 1 was the hypnotism, and step 2 is this mental preparation. When Jim's brain is transferred, Chris will forever live in the sunken place but still be able to see and hear what's happening. Chris asks why black people, so Jim explains that people want to be faster and stronger. However he doesn't care about Chris's race, he only wants new eyes. After the video ends, Chris notices that he scratched the chair so much that he's pulled out the cotton. When the TV plays the teacup again, Chris faints. Minutes later Jim is asleep on the surgical table and Dean starts cutting his head open. Jeremy unstraps Chris and turns around to get the wheelchair ready. However Chris hits him twice with a ball from the pool table to knock him out. It turns out Chris used the cotton from the chair to block his ears, so the teacup couldn't hypnotize him and he only pretended to faint. When Dean hears a noise, he comes out of the operating room, only to suddenly be stabbed by Chris with a stuffed deer head he took from the wall. As Dean collapses, he accidentally knocks down a candle, and soon the flames start spreading. Next Chris goes to the kitchen to get his phone, and Georgina runs as soon as she sees him covered in blood. Missy also sees him and rushes to get the cup, but Chris reaches it first and breaks it. Then Missy tries to stab him with a knife, however Chris easily blocks the attack with his hand. Since the blade is impaled in his palm, he turns it around and after some struggle, he stabs Missy to kill her too. Now Chris can leave, but when he reaches the front door Jeremy jumps on him and kicks the door to close it. The guys struggle for a few minutes and Jeremy starts choking Chris, who reaches for the door again. When Jeremy kicks it, Chris stabs his leg and causes him to collapse. Then Chris stomps on Jeremy's head several times to kill him and takes his keys. Meanwhile Rose is upstairs listening to music on her headphones and looking up his next victim on the internet. Behind her, all the pictures of her exes hang on the wall. When Chris gets in Jeremy's car, he finds a helmet on the passenger's seat, which means Jeremy kidnapped Andre. As he drives off he calls 911, and this distraction causes him to run over Georgina. Her scream alerts Rose to the chaos. Seeing the body on the ground causes Chris to remember his mother's death, so he picks up an unconscious Georgina and takes her away in the car. At that moment Rose emerges from the burning house and tries to open fire, but the car is already gone. She whispers the word grandma, revealing that Georgina and Walter are actually her grandparents in new bodies. When Georgina wakes up, she tells Chris that he ruined her house and attacks him, causing the car to crash into a tree and knocking them both out. Chris awakens quickly and discovers that Georgina is dead. Suddenly a shot destroys the rearview mirror, so Chris gets out of the car and tries to limp away while Rose keeps shooting at him. Walter has also come, and he runs fast enough to tackle Chris to the ground. As Walter tries to kill him, Chris pulls out his phone and takes a picture so the flash brings out the real Walter. Rose comes closer thinking they've won. Walter pretends he's still her grandfather and takes the gun from her to then shoot her in the stomach. Refusing to live with his mind like this, Walter uses the gun to self-delete. Rose is still alive and tries to grab the weapon, but Chris takes it first. She apologizes and swears she loves him, however Chris doesn't believe her and starts choking her. When she starts to smile, he decides to let go and leave her to slowly die alone on the road like his mother. At that moment Rod arrives in his TSA car. Rose asks for help but she's ignored. The guys get in the car and drive away while Rod says I told you so. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.